I wouldn't sleep in that house tonight if I were you. The woman who had sold it to us said those words before I had even sat down. For a moment, I simply stood there, one hand on the back of the vinyl chair at Miller's Diner, staring at Evelyn Carter as though she had lost her senses. A week earlier, my husband Richard and I had moved into the old farmhouse outside Franklin, Tennessee. We had spent months talking about retirement, about quiet mornings on the porch and grandchildren visiting on holidays. Now the former owner was asking me to keep secrets from my own husband. "Don't tell Richard you came," she added, her voice barely above a whisper. The diner was nearly empty. A ceiling fan clicked overhead while an old coffee maker hummed behind the counter. Outside, pickup trucks lined the gravel lot, and the smell of rain drifted in through the screen door each time someone walked in. That morning, I had been unpacking dishes when Evelyn's message appeared on my phone. "Come alone. Your husband can't know." At 68, I wasn't the kind of woman who chased trouble. I had spent 32 years teaching 3rd grade and another 8 caring for my mother after her stroke. Richard and I had been married for 32 years. We had weathered layoffs, surgeries, and the loss of his brother. I thought I knew the man, sitting on our porch every evening with a glass of sweet tea in his hand. Still, something about that message had unsettled me. I told Richard the first was going into town for groceries. He hardly looked up from the toolbox in the yard. "Grab some coffee while you're there," he said. Now Evelyn sat across from me, twisting her wedding ring around her finger. "You deserve to know the truth about that house," she said. I frowned. "What truth?" Instead of answering, she slid a thick manila envelope onto the table. "There are documents in here that Richard hoped you would never see." I almost laughed. Richard had handled every meeting with the bank, every paper at closing, every conversation with the attorney. "You've made some mistake." Her expression never changed. I wish I had. Then she leaned across the table and quietly said something that made my stomach drop. "Your husband didn't buy that property last week." She pushed the envelope toward me. "He lost it 15 years ago."
I sat in my car outside Miller's Diner for nearly 15 minutes before I opened the envelope. Rain tapped against the windshield, and the wipers pushed back and forth in a slow rhythm that gave me too much time to think. Evelyn's words kept circling in my head. "Your husband didn't buy that property last week. He lost it 15 years ago." I almost drove home without looking inside. But I've seen enough in my life to know that avoiding the truth never changes it. The first document was a property survey dated 2011. The second was a loan agreement with Richard's signature at the bottom. By the third page, my hands had started to shake. 15 years earlier, Richard and 2 business partners had borrowed heavily against the farmhouse and the surrounding land, hoping to sell it to a development company from Nashville. The deal collapsed, the debt remained, and the property disappeared into years of legal disputes. Yet somehow Richard had never said a word to me. I folded the papers and drove home in silence. Richard was on the porch when I pulled into the driveway, sitting in his old chair with a glass of sweet tea beside him. Fresh-cut grass covered the yard, and the evening air smelled of charcoal from a neighbor's barbecue. He smiled when he saw me. "Find everything you needed?" he asked. "More or less," I said, forcing a smile of my own. That night, after he had gone to bed, I spread the papers across the kitchen table. The old coffee maker hummed softly while the ceiling fan clicked overhead. Hidden among the legal forms was a handwritten note from an attorney warning that access to part of the basement foundation had been restricted until ownership questions were settled. That didn't sit right with me. We had toured every room in that house before buying it, yet no one had mentioned restrictions beneath the property. The next morning, while Richard drove into town for hardware supplies, I went to the county courthouse. The records clerk, a woman named Denise who looked about my age, studied the documents and frowned. "Well, I'll tell you what," she said, adjusting her glasses. "Folks have argued over this place for years." She disappeared into a back room and returned carrying a thick file. I opened it and immediately recognized Richard's name. But it was the line written beneath it that made my stomach turn. "Pending investigation into concealed assets hidden below the residence." I carried the courthouse file out to my car and sat there for a long time, staring at the words "concealed assets hidden below the residence." The rain had stopped, leaving the courthouse steps slick and shining in the afternoon sun. For 32 years, Richard had been the steady one in our marriage. He balanced the checkbook, filed the taxes, and never forgot a birthday. I wasn't ready to believe he had built our retirement around a lie, but something about those documents simply would not let me rest. When I got home, Richard was repairing a loose cabinet door in the kitchen. He looked up and smiled. "You were gone longer than I expected." "I stopped by the grocery store," I replied, setting my purse on the counter. He nodded and went back to his work. I stood there watching him, trying to match the man in front of me with the signatures and legal notices tucked inside my bag. It just didn't sit right. For the next few days, I said nothing. Each night after Richard had fallen asleep, I spread the papers across the kitchen table and studied them beneath the yellow light over the stove. One name appeared over and over again: Harold Whitaker, the attorney who had represented the Carter family during the dispute. According to the courthouse records, he was still practicing law in Franklin. I called his office the following morning. His secretary paused when I mentioned the farmhouse. "Mr. Whitaker doesn't see many clients these days," she said, "but he asked me to fit you in tomorrow afternoon." His office sat above an old hardware store near the courthouse square. The waiting room smelled of old paper and furniture polish, and family photographs covered the walls. Harold himself had to be in his 80s. He studied me quietly before motioning toward a chair. "You're Richard Bennett's wife," he said. I nodded. "I'm trying to understand what happened." For a moment, he looked out the window. "Mrs. Bennett, your husband never told you the whole story because he was ashamed of his part in it." He unlocked a filing cabinet and removed a thin envelope that had clearly been opened many times before. Inside were bank statements, survey maps, and a letter written by Thomas Carter shortly before his death. Then Harold slid a faded photograph across the desk. I recognized Richard immediately, but standing beside him were two men I had never seen before, and one of them was still listed as co-owner of my house. I picked up the photograph and studied the two men standing beside Richard. They were younger then, all three of them wearing work boots and smiling, in front of a surveyor's truck parked near the farmhouse. On the back of the picture, someone had written the date, June 2011. My eyes returned to Harold Whitaker. "You're telling me one of these men still owns part of my house?" Harold folded his hands on his desk. "Legally, yes. At least on paper." I felt my stomach tighten. Richard and I had signed every closing document together just 7 days earlier. The bank had approved the loan. The title company had cleared the sale. Yet according to the attorney sitting across from me, our home still belonged in part to a man I had never met. "Who is he?" I asked. "His name is Daniel Mercer," Harold replied. "He handled the finances for the partnership. After the deal collapsed, he disappeared from town." "And Richard never mentioned any of this?" Harold gave me a tired look. "People bury old mistakes, Mrs. Bennett. Sometimes they bury them so deep that they convince themselves they're gone." I drove home in silence. The county roads were wet from the morning rain, and fresh-cut grass lay in neat rows along the shoulders. When I pulled into the driveway, Richard was sitting on the porch swing, drinking sweet tea and reading the local paper as if nothing in the world had changed. "You all right?" he asked. "Just tired." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. Folks notice more than people think, and I wondered if he sensed that something had shifted between us. That night, after Richard had fallen asleep, I took a flashlight and went down to the basement. The old concrete steps creaked beneath my feet. I had read the inspection reports 3 times, and each one mentioned an unfinished storage room beneath the foundation. For nearly 20 minutes, I found nothing. Then, hidden behind a row of shelves stacked with paint cans and tools, I saw it, a narrow wooden door secured with a rusted padlock. Stamped into the metal was the same year written on the photograph, 2011. My heart pounded as I tugged on the lock, but it wouldn't budge. I snapped a picture and climbed back upstairs. The next morning, while Richard drove into town, I called Evelyn and told her what I had found. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then, in a trembling voice, she whispered, "Before you open that door, there's someone you need to meet." When she told me his name, I nearly dropped the phone. Daniel Mercer is alive. I nearly dropped the phone when Evelyn said Daniel Mercer was alive. For years, everyone in Franklin had assumed he had vanished after the partnership collapsed, yet she spoke as though she had seen him only yesterday. She gave me an address outside town and asked me not to tell Richard where I was going, By then, I had stopped asking myself whether that was right. I simply needed answers. Daniel lived at the end of a gravel road lined with old maple trees. His small brick house sat behind a weathered fence, with an old mailbox leaning beside the driveway. He opened the door before I could knock. "You must be Margaret Bennett," he said quietly. I nodded, surprised that he knew my name. Inside, the house smelled of coffee and old books. Family photographs covered the walls, and a baseball game played softly in another room. Daniel looked to be in his 70s, his hair almost white. He motioned for me to sit at the kitchen table and placed a worn, cardboard box between us. "I've been expecting this visit for a long time," he said. The box contained ledgers, bank records, and letters dating back more than 15 years. Piece by piece, the truth came into focus. Richard and his partners had borrowed against the Carter farm, hoping to sell it to developers from Nashville. When the deal failed, Thomas Carter was left carrying debts he barely understood. Lawsuits followed. Friendships ended. The farmhouse sat tangled in legal disputes for years. "But why hide all this from me?" I asked. Daniel removed his glasses and looked down at the table. "Because your husband was ashamed." He handed me one final document, a settlement agreement signed 3 years earlier. Richard had quietly repaid his share of the debt, but he had never corrected the property records. One partner had died, the other had disappeared. Daniel had remained listed as co-owner simply because no one had finished the paperwork. A week later, my attorney filed the necessary documents with the county court. The records were updated, the ownership dispute was resolved, and the truth finally came out, not through gossip, but through evidence. That evening, Richard sat beside me on the porch swing as crickets chirped in the distance. He admitted that he had hidden the past because he feared losing the life we had built together. I listened without anger. The farmhouse remained ours. But our marriage would take time to heal. As the sun disappeared behind the trees, I realized something simple. A house can survive old secrets, but a marriage survives only when the truth finally walks through the front door.